Welcome everyone to this week's video lecture for History 2315 or World History 1. So our focus this week is on the time period between 1000 Common Era and 1300 Common Era. And this is something that the chapter and my lecture, we call this Becoming the World. And really what they're talking about here is this is the period in which we start to see greater cultural interaction between very, very geographically disparate societies. And we're also seeing the formation of four key spheres of the world, basically Europe, the Islamic world, India, and China. All of these areas are going to maintain their position as major players in the modernization of the world. And really what we're talking about when we talk about becoming the world is this rapidly increasing process of globalization and intercultural interaction. And so that's generally what we're seeing play out between 1000 and 1300 Common Era. And there are three common themes that emerge and shape world history and really shape the modern world. They all start to take place during this time period. First, we're going to slowly see maritime or sea-based trade routes start to take away the lion's share of trade from land-based trade routes. In a lot of ways, the sea-based trade routes are going to supplant some land-based trade routes and supplement others. But in all reality, we're seeing that naval authority and naval power is going to become far more important during this period because a large share of the world's trade is going to shift to the high seas. We're going to see that trade taking place over the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, the Indian Ocean, and the Pacific as well. So the second major theme that's going to occur between 1000 and 1300 Common Era is the spread of common languages and religions. So this is going to happen a little bit differently in each of the regions we're looking at. We'll talk about some of that today. Some of that stuff we're going to leave to later lectures because we're going to go into some of those topics in greater depth, particularly Christendom in Europe and the Crusades. We're going to talk a lot about religious identity and what that means in Europe. But this is going to help the spread of these common features, the languages and the religion, help to create these four major spheres of the world that we're looking at this week. And then finally, the spread of Mongolian influence as it really started to take shape under Genghis Khan. They are going to be spreading all the way from Asia into the Near East, all the way up to Eastern Europe. They get about as far as Poland in Eastern Europe. But this is going to actually facilitate and create greater patterns of trade, and it's going to increase the amount of mobility and migration that's occurring in that part of the world. And so those are the three things that we're seeing playing out. This is going to have an impact on everybody who's living in the old world at the very least. Now, there are a few notable exceptions, and again, I overlooked those in this week's lectures. Your textbook talks a little bit about what's happening in sub-Saharan Africa and in the Americas, where Native Americans are living. And the fact of the matter is, I am not going to talk about that at all because that's a separate subject for us. We're going to take a look at what sub-Saharan African societies and Native American societies looked like on the eve of European expansion. Before they started getting pulled into this increasingly globalized world, mostly through trade networks, and that's how it's going to generally play out. So don't expect to see or hear anything about those areas of the world. It's not that I'm just completely ignoring them, it's that I'm putting them off for a later lecture. And I think we can say the same about, I'm not going to talk a great deal about Christian Europe because we're going to start to cover a little bit more about that when we get into the Crusades and the Reconquista and some of those things that are happening in continental Europe. So the first thing we need to talk about in this lecture is the transition to sea-based or maritime trade routes. There are multiple factors contributing to the rise and increase in sea-based trading. And I want to be clear about something. It's not like at some point between 1000 and 1300 AD, people all around the old world woke up and said, you know, we should just start doing trade with boats. That seems like a good idea. There has always been sea-based trade routes. There's been sea-based trade routes since going as far back as looking at the early Mediterranean, the Hellenistic world, Egypt, all of those areas. There were boats carrying trade across the Mediterranean. But that method of trade becomes very, very dominant during this period of 1000 to 1300. And there's a reason for that. First, it's the methods of navigation and map making are improving drastically during this time. Societies in China, in India, in the Mediterranean, in Europe, they're all starting to invest a little bit more energy and a little bit more time into map making and cartography, using the stars to be able to chart your path on the ocean. And so this is, if you think about it, it's kind of a monumental task to undertake. China is going to be developing, in Song, China, they're developing a needlepoint compass that can tell you which direction you're going. That's pretty useful when you're out in the middle of the ocean with no land to mark anything. The Europeans are investing heavily in map making. Wealthy people and people who are interested in carrying out overseas exploration are starting to pay cartographers good money. And it's an interesting process. I always get a little sidetracked when I start talking about European map making during this time. Their maps are not necessarily, if you were to pick one of these old maps up, they're not geographically the most accurate map you're going to ever look at. They're not telling you some key things you need to know about, maybe necessarily the depth of the ocean at any given point. They're not telling you how currents blow across the Atlantic. They're not even giving you accurate representations of certain land masses. However, it's interesting to look at a European map from this time because it tells us a lot about the psyche of the people. For example, last week's lecture and in your textbook this week, they show you a map of West Africa. And right in the middle, there's a guy sitting holding up 2 pieces of gold. And what this is showing you, if you're looking at this European map, this is not the most accurate map. It doesn't tell us where any of the relevant kingdoms of West Africa are. But what this is telling you is that Europeans are concerned about one thing, and it's gold. That's what they're looking for when they start actually making inroads and engaging with Africa. And so that's something that is important, is that what they choose to draw on these maps, they do have a purpose. There's a reason behind it. Now, that's a crude drawing. It's not telling you a whole lot of geographical information. But what it's telling you is that Europeans know there's a bunch of gold in that part of West Africa, and they want to get to it. Other things you tend to see are images of sea monsters and serpents coming up through the ocean. And as fanciful and as strange as that might seem to us in the modern day, that was a European way of saying this is a dangerous stretch of sea. Maybe it's very rocky. Maybe you have shallow depths that come up out of nowhere that make you run aground and sink your ship. Maybe that this is an area where there's large carnivorous animals that might eat somebody who falls overboard. And so what you're seeing in these maps and the map making of the time period reflects not just the interest in sort of charting out other areas of the world and making contact with them, but also what the motivation behind that contact might be. It also tells you about some of these things that Europeans don't fully understand at this point. And the same can be said of other maps that are being made, but this is a practice that is heavily centered in Europe. Whereas cartographic and navigational technologies are coming more out of the Arab world and out of the Chinese world at this point in time. And so that's just one of the developments that's happening here. Secondly, I think it's kind of suffices to say that boat building gets a lot better during this time. Their techniques, their ability to actually build boats that have overseas and long distance trade capabilities, they all improve during this time. And so these newer boats are capable of withstanding the heavy ocean currents, getting rocked up and down on 30-foot waves. Their sails are now effective enough to make good headway over any ocean where you're getting a good current behind you. But also, it's all about the draft. And that's a big part of what's happening with these ships. They're now able to make big boats capable of carrying a lot of people, a lot of products, maybe some large animals. But there are these things that are being carried by the boats, but the boats are getting more shallow on their bottom. They can come into bays more easily and pull right up to the coast. That's what's changing the ability to do trade overseas at this time in terms of the boat making and the naval technology that is being explored during this time period. And that's not something that's acute to any one part of the world. By the time we start getting a little closer to the late 1400s, the Europeans have definitely pulled ahead in terms of their naval technology and their sea-based technology. Their boats are very, very effective at long-distance trade. And they start to overshadow some boats that are being built in China or in the Arab-dominated Indian Ocean, as it is mostly Arab traders that are dominating those trade networks. But that's something that it's interesting to look at this because while Europeans are largely seen as being the naval powers of the modern world, and that certainly will come to fruition, we do see the technology belongs to other people. Other people are capable of building big warships with shallow drafts that can go into and out of bays. And so this is something that it kind of poses an interesting question to us as world historians as to why Europeans seem to jump forward when it comes to naval exploration and technology. And there's been a lot of theories put out about that, but we tend not to get into that too much in this earlier section of world history. Finally, there are mechanisms emerging to protect the investment in long distance and sea-based trading. They all start to emerge during this time period. In a lot of ways, the emergence of maritime trading and sea-based trading would give rise to a lot of the institutions that we associate with modern mercantile economies. When we think of there's concepts being put out now like profit maximization. Free market capitalism starts to become a new, and this is something we'll get into a little bit more when we look at Europe on the eve of expansion, because this is pretty particular to Europe. But these ideas like free market capitalism, institutions like banks start to flourish. People need loans, they need insurance. You have to think about what these kinds of overseas endeavors really entail. What you're asking is, we need somebody to get on a boat and basically live on this boat for the next 4 to 5 months of their lives if everything goes really, really smoothly. Sail to some far off land and buy some obscure product that may or may not fetch a good price back in a European market. This is really the origin of capitalism, if you want to get down to brass tacks. What you're starting to say here is free market capitalism as a concept says the product is worth whatever someone's willing to pay for it. That's what free market capitalism is all about. The job of the government's not to come in and say, this pen right here needs to be priced at $4.95. Basically, if someone wants to buy my ugly sweater for $4.5 million, then my ugly sweater's worth $4.5 million. That's free market capitalism. And that's what's driving this overseas trade. I could sit there in Europe and be a farmer for the rest of my life and barely eke out a living for myself, barely put enough food on the table to feed my wife and kids. But if I can sail all the way to India and pick up some very, very exotic and expensive black pepper that makes rich people's food taste better, the rich people in Europe are willing to pay a ton of money for it. So is black pepper worth wasting your life for? Now, I'll make the argument. I do love it on steak and some other foods, but you're probably not going to put your life on the line for black pepper unless black pepper is worth a lot of money. And that's what is starting to emerge during this time. Free market capitalism. It's worth getting on a boat and seeing what they're selling over in India or China or in the Islamic world or in Europe, depending on where your point of origin is, or even in Africa, in the markets of East Africa, in the Swahili states. All those places are worth going to. They're worth taking a look in their markets because some rich guy in Europe might be willing to pay a lot for the product that you bring back. In addition to that, you're talking about the fact that you're putting a bunch of people on a boat, and at this point it's all males in almost every culture of the world. There's very few cultures that allow women onto boats during this time period. But it's guys getting on a boat, and they're basically, the boat itself is an incredibly large sum of money. The guys all expect to get paid. You need to take a trade product with you to trade when you get to whatever market you're going to. And so all this costs a lot of money. If I'm the big shot who's putting his money behind this, what happens if the boat sinks 4 miles off the coast of France right after I sent it out? I lose all that money. I lose the men. Well, okay, that's not really the biggest problem for a European merchant or an Arab merchant or any of these other merchants in this time period. The guys are replaceable. However, I got to pay their salaries to their families. I have to now replace that boat. All of the cargo on it's gone. I didn't make any money because it never got to where it was going. This is where insurance comes into play. Somebody's got to be willing to back this endeavor up because I don't want to lose my shirt if I'm the only one invested in this. And so you're starting to see a lot of the modern economic ideas, a lot of the notions that dominate modern economies come out of this transition to sea-based trading. Very important thing shift that's happening here between 1000 Common Era and 1300 Common Era. Now, because of these developments, the land-based trade routes, which would usually be facilitated by the use of pack animals like donkeys, horses, and camels, were slowly but surely being supplanted by these sea-based trade routes. It's faster to let the wind push you than it is to hope that your donkey makes it from point A to point B. To make sure that your horses are well taken care of. See, the nice thing about a boat is you don't got to feed a boat. The boat doesn't need to drink. The boat doesn't need anything. The boat is there. It's a piece of equipment. You use it like anything else. And so between 1000 and 1300, you're starting to see those land-based routes do diminish in terms of their importance. They don't go away. They're going to maintain all the way through the modern era, but they certainly are no longer carrying the lion's share of global trade. Now, in the Indian Ocean, that trade network was mostly controlled by Arab traders operating out of the Arabian Peninsula. And they built a specific type of boat, what's known as a dhow. These dhows were triangular shaped sailboats, triangular sailed. I put pictures of them in the lecture. I'm not even going to try and illustrate it with my hands. But these types of sails, they are best designed to capture the monsoon winds of the Indian Ocean. And those are the most common type of distance trading vessel that you're going to see in that part of the world. And so those are the types of boats that are dominating trade in the Indian Ocean. As these distance trades by sea-based shipping lanes start to increase in Eurasia and North Africa, you start to see what they call entrepôts emerge. This is a French word, but basically what an entrepôt is this is a large coastal trading hub. And these things start to flourish. Places like Alexandria and Cairo, which in this period of 1000 to 1300 are under the control of mostly Muslim and Jewish trading firms, they become the major cosmopolitan centers of the Mediterranean. If you want something, you'll find it in Cairo or Alexandria. If you want something, you will find it in any of these entrepôts around the world. This is where you go to buy exotic things. And so now it's not just the local goods that you have showing up in these entrepôts. You got stuff that's coming from halfway around the world. You can go to Cairo and find Chinese porcelain that's been shipped there by boat. You can go to Alexandria and you're going to find products that were made in India shipped up, jitna cloths and things like that. So these are really, really important sorts of shifts. We're going to start to see the major modern population centers are all centered around coastal territories. They're not inland areas anymore. You rarely see inland capitals or inland trading capitals or trading ports because they're always going to be based on one of these sea-based routes moving forward. So there is a case study in our weekly lecture that I'm not going to beat a dead horse. I'm going to kind of just skip over that and let you take a look. It does fall outside the purview of our chronology for this week's lecture. But we can see that Ming China is going to sort of take out into the Pacific and the Indian Ocean and the Bay of Bengal. They go as far as East Africa, but there's these really interesting treasure voyages that happen as part of the Ming Dynasty in Chinese history. And they build these incredibly huge ships. I mean, these things are giant. And they're not so much for overseas trade as much as they are for, it is trade, but they're not going over looking to sell a bunch of products that were made in China and then buy a bunch of products for sale in China. These are called the treasure voyages for a reason. These massive ships go all over the world and they buy the most exotic goods you could possibly get. And so these ships are massive. They can hold elephants, rhinos, hippos, things, exotic animals, giraffes in the holds of these ships. They dwarf the caravels and the types of ships that were being used for overseas trade in Europe. But it's an interesting little case study. I put it in there not because it fits the chronology, but it fits the theme of what we're talking about. And there is this big, like I said, big question in world history as to why it is that Europe kind of dominates the seas in the modern period instead of China. And the reason that I put this case study in is I give some explanation as to why we think, and we're not positive as historians, but why we think China abruptly turns inwards and focuses, they basically stop these overseas trades altogether. And so there's just a little bit of it's an interesting little case study that highlights this shift towards maritime routes and what that means to the overall society. And what that means to the growth and wealth of certain societies around the world. And it happens to fit within one of the four main spheres that we're going to be talking about this week that you're reading about in your lectures and your textbook. So, as the maritime trade and navigation increases during this period, we see two distinctive trends start to emerge from this. First, larger regions of the world start forming a common cultural elements. They share languages, they share religions, because these things are starting to transcend the boundaries of the nation state. The idea of a religious spread, it's bigger than one country. It's bigger than one empire. It can spread beyond those borders and those boundaries, and a lot of times it helps to facilitate the growth of the empire, as something we're going to see happening in different regions of the world today. This is something that is interesting, though, because we're seeing that bigger portions of the world start having a uniform identity. And uniform might be a bit of overkill in terms of the statement, but at least commonality within their identity. We start to see these things that make people associate with one another and differentiate from other parts of the world. So that's the first trend. The other trend is that as these regions grow bigger, as these common cultures start to emerge, they come into more frequent contact with one another through these sea-based trade routes and through this sort of intercultural interaction that's happening. In some ways, this means a more rapid spread of products, of people, of ideas and technology. And that's something we're going to see when we look at the Europe on the eve of expansion and them setting out into the Atlantic world. They are going to begin a very big process in world history known as the Columbian Exchange, and we'll take a look at that. But in other ways, these large spheres are now more frequently coming into conflict with one another. You're starting to see more warfare, more internecine conflict between these major spheres of the world. This is most clearly highlighted through the Crusades, something we'll be talking about as a standalone topic as we move forward in the class. But the Crusades are a perfect example of this. The Islamic world is growing bigger, more unified, fragmented, but at least more unified in their religious identity. And the same as can be said of Europe. Europe is becoming far more unified around this identity as Christian. And so when they launched the Crusades and start attacking into Palestine and the Holy Land, this is going to bring the Islamic world and the European Christian world into conflict with one another. It's a common trend that we're going to see play out during this time period of 1000 to 1300. Now, again, we're not going to talk at great length about that in this particular lecture because that's something we're leaving for a later date. So, the four main spheres of the world that start to emerge and become dominant players on a global scale during this time are Europe in their Christian identity, something we'll talk just a little bit about, the Islamic world, China, and India. Those are the four places that are going to, from this point forward, and you can even look at today, these are the major areas of the globe in terms of modernization and globalization. These are the biggest players throughout modern world history. And so we're going to start, for our purposes, talking about the Islamic world. So the Muslim world, unlike what we're seeing with Europe, where they're starting to unify around a Christian identity, the Muslim world between 1000 and 1300 is actually fragmenting rather than unifying. First, you have some extreme climatic pressures hitting this part of the world. You have the lowering of the Nile, and Egypt has been the Islamic world's breadbasket for many hundreds of years at this point. In addition to that, you have seriously lacking rainfall. The territory over which Islam spread is largely dry and desert. And so you have very little water to work with in agriculture. Mesopotamia is no longer this fertile crescent as much as it is sort of a dry, arid land. You also have routinely freezing temperatures at night in these areas of the desert. That drives all of that together. It drives down food production in most of the Islamic world. And so, because the food production is not as high, their population numbers are dwindling, all the way from North Africa to the Iranian plateau. Also, between 900 and 1200, and we saw a little bit about this when we looked at the spread of Islam in Africa, that case study we did in the last lecture. There is a major schism happening within the religious structure of Islam anyway. You have the breakdown into different sects or denominations of Islam. We saw very clearly the conflict between the Shiites and the Sunni Muslims. That's going to lead to increased warfare among the entities of the Muslim world. They're fighting with one another, not just other regions of the globe. You can also see that that's pretty clearly seen in terms of that sort of religious schism between the Fatimid dynasty and the Zirids in North Africa. And so religious schisms are a problem. You also see Sufism emerging in West Africa and North Africa during this time period. So there's a third denomination of Islam, and really it's Sufism that helped spread Islam in a lot of ways. This is kind of like the missionary sect of Islam, if you will. But this is an important sort of shift that's going to happen in the Islamic world. We're starting to see that religious fragmentation. There's also ethnic fragmentation. You see that there are some Muslims that come from an Arabic background, others are of Berber origin, others are of Iranian or Persian origin, and still others of Turkic origin. And you can clearly see this conflict between the Ghaznavid and Seljuk dynasties, with the Ghaznavid being largely Persian and the Seljuk dynasty being Turkic. And the Seljuk are actually going to be very dominant and end up spreading all the way down into northern India. Despite the fact that we have fragmentation happening in the Islamic world, they're still growing. The religion is still bringing more and more territories into what we can call the Islamic world during this period of 1000 to 1300. The final thing I want to say about the Islamic world during this period is that they really become the repository and epicenter for all of the ancient world's shared knowledge. The Greek texts, the Latin texts, and then all of the texts in Arabic, they're all saved in the Islamic world. When Europe goes through its dark ages, most of the shared knowledge and understanding of what was achieved in the Hellenistic era of Greece and Rome, it kind of gets thrown by the wayside. They push it in the trash. Europeans don't have a method for maintaining this kind of information throughout the Dark Ages and all the raids and problems in their society. But all of that gets stored in the Islamic world. And without that sort of maintenance of that knowledge, it probably doesn't have a resurgence in Europe when we get to something like the Renaissance. And so there is a very fragile and sort of a fragile sort of holding and relationship between the Islamic world and the European world at this time. But it is important to understand that Europe is going to have to go back to the Islamic world to try to recover some of that information. So that is definitely an important element of what the Islamic world is doing. They're making incredible scientific, educational, philosophical, literary, artistic sorts of contributions to global history at this point. So, the second region of the world that we're going to be looking at that's going to play a dominant role in the quickly globalizing and modernizing world is India. And your textbook refers to India as a cultural mosaic. So in a lot of the same ways that we see the Muslim world fragmenting over some doctrinal differences within the religion and heavily over ethnic origin, India is their emergence into the globalized world also saw political and religious fragmentation. But India has long been a valuable center of global trade, even back when we're looking at land-based trade routes. India has always had some products that the rest of the world deeply and heavily desire. And so they are important on those old ancient land trading routes, but they also become super critical during this time period when we start to see the shift towards sea-based trading routes, because India is in the dead center position that most people would want to be in. They're resting between the resource-rich Pacific Ocean and the resource-rich Indian Ocean, and they're getting trade from both. And you're starting to see entrepôts pop up all over southern India that will become major sites of trade. And you need to think of it this way: if an Arab trader wants to get to goods in Chinese markets, they're going to have to go around India and are probably going to stop in southern India along the way. Now, Hinduism in this region had already provided some level of religious unity to the inhabitants, but that really only spread heavily into South India. And there in South India, you have a number of minor princes and kings, rulers that are basically overseeing smaller, more decentralized kingdoms, and they're known as rajas. The rajas were figures of incredible influence within their own little territories. They would patronize artists and poets, and they pushed southern India into a period of intense cultural flourishing during this time. They utilized the ancient Sanskrit languages to enshrine a new era of cultural development during this time in southern India. But India isn't just comprised of the southern states. In addition to what we're seeing in South India in the Rajasthans, you also have Turkic Muslims migrating heavily into northern India and Pakistan. There they're going to establish a very important kingdom known as the Delhi Sultanate. This sultanate would foster religious, linguistic, and cultural diversity between 1206 Common Era and 1526 Common Era in Pakistan and northern India. As this state expands southwards into the territories of the Rajas would be integrated as independent sultanates. And so at one point, the Delhi Sultanate spreads almost to the tip of southern India. But the Rajas aren't being forced to give up Hinduism. They're being told, yeah, you can keep doing what you want to do. There is going to be a tax placed on non-Muslims. They pay a little bit higher price to worship whatever it is that they want to worship, and in this case, we're mostly talking about Hindus. But the Hindu people will retain their Hindu religious identity. They're simply paying tribute now to the Delhi Sultanate. And so this helps to keep this, there is political unity over this area of India. It's all being brought under the political auspices of this one large sort of kingdom or empire. But within that kingdom and empire, there is a lot of religious diversity. There is a lot of ethnic diversity and racial diversity. So in sum, this is why India is being called a cultural mosaic. It's politically integrated. It's got this area that they're ruling over a lot of different diverse types of people. But they are always able to foster a very fragile but consistent peace between different ethnicities. Here you have Dravidians, Turks, Arabs, Malagasys, Persians. And you also have a lot of different religions cropping up here in India. You have Hinduism and Islam that we've already talked about, but there's also Buddhism. There's also Zoroastrianism, that monotheistic religion that's unrelated to the Abrahamic traditions that emerged in Persia. So these are all there, present, existent in India. But India continues to grow in its size, its shape, and its influence while all maintaining political integration, but also having this very fragmented and diverse type of population within it. So it makes it a really unique sort of place to look at in the overall scope of world history. Now, moving forward, we got to talk a little bit about China. China is an interesting case here because we already saw a pretty strong unification of China under the Han Dynasty. Now, China underwent a lot of shifts between the last time we looked at them in the Han Dynasty and this period that we're concerned with today, basically 1000 to 1300. In the interim, China had broken down under intense pressure during the Tang Dynasty. There was a lot of peasant uprisings, and eventually the Tang Dynasty would collapse in turmoil in 907 Common Era. It is the Song Dynasty that comes along after the Tang Dynasty, and they are the ones who are going to restore and reunify a common culture that we identify as Chinese. And they generally are going to do this through strong centralized leadership. In 960 Common Era, their ruler Taizu will reunite China and proclaim the Song Dynasty. So really that's the origins of the Song Dynasty. And we tend to date this as lasting between 960 Common Era and 1279 Common Era. So the Song rulers, when they start to put China back together, they're not able to recapture the lands that they lost to the west and to the north. And so they pretty much are going to have to give up on that area. In addition to that, you have in the 1100s the rise of the people known as Jurchens in the area that we today call Manchuria. This is the area immediately north of Song China. They set up their own Manchurian Empire or Jurchen Empire up into the north, basically today kind of covering parts of North China and parts of the Korean Peninsula. Now, what that means is from 1127 onwards and the establishment of this Jurchen dynasty to the north, the Song rulers have to focus on dominating everything to the south. That's where their state is going to be built. They establish a new capital at Hangzhou. And then from there, the Song dynasty is going to basically bring all of these territories of southern China together under their auspices. And the southern Song dynasty lasts from 1127 to 1279. Now, this era of Song China is definitely an era of prosperity and innovation. There is incredible growth during this time period. Population doubles during the Song and Tang dynasties collectively. China's population blows up to about 100 million during this time period. China is going to become the most populous country in the world between 1000 and 1300 during the height of the Song dynasty. Their science and technology is going to change pretty rapidly during this time period. It's during this time that the Chinese invent gunpowder. Their trademark form of porcelain construction for art and practical goods like pots, ceramics, pottery, all that stuff, tea kettles, teacups, things like that. The Song dynasty invents a mechanical clock, basically a clock tower that works regardless of whether or not the sun is out. This is a big improvement from the sundial. You can tell time around the clock, 24 hours a day. They issue paper money for the first time in Chinese history. They start to put together movable type prints. They have blocks of individual characters. So basically they can start to mass produce literature during this time period. In mathematics, the Chinese developed the use of negative numbers during this time. So if you're like me and you hate math, thank you, China. You're the ones who made things exponentially more complicated with negative numbers. The Arabic world is the one that preserves the use of the number 0. They start working that into calculations and what that really means. And so you're seeing a lot of mathematical development during this time period as well. Agriculturally, there are major advances in Chinese farming during this time period. The main advance is that there is a new strain of rice produced that allows the farmer to produce 2 crops a year rather than 1. This is called champa rice. This is unbelievably important. You don't grow the world's largest population without some sort of technological innovation like this. They found and cultivated a new strain of rice, and this is going to be able to double the food production of China's agricultural sector, and that's what allows that population growth to occur. Now, as far as trade in foreign context, in the early Tang period, trade with the West was made mostly over the Silk Road still. But during the Tang decline, the Chinese start to look more and more at the ocean trade routes as a viable way of making money. From there, trade is going to stretch outwards to Japan, Southeast Asia, and then as you saw with the case study of Zhang He, when you start moving a little further in Chinese history, they make it all the way to India and East Africa. This kind of expansion in trade all around the Indian Ocean, around the South Pacific, also helps to spread the common religion of the Song dynasty, and that is Buddhism. The Song used Buddhism as a way of unifying the country. It is definitely a big part of what they're doing here. But there is no such thing as a state religion in Song-era China. Buddhism is encouraged. It spreads very, very heavily during this time period. But in all reality, there is no state religion. You're allowed to worship whatever you like, whatever ideology sort of speaks to you. That's good enough for Song China. They're willing to allow people to practice whatever they want. You're not being forced into Buddhism at this time. But it is spreading right alongside those trade routes in much the same way we saw that happening with Islam in North and West Africa. So there are some other key changes that happen in Chinese society during this time period of the Song Dynasty. First, there are some structural changes to society. You start to see a slight diminishment in the importance and power of elite and noble families during this time period. In other words, the super elite, the super wealthy start to diminish during the Song Dynasty. And they are replaced by wealthy scholar officials from a new upper class called the gentry. And so the gentry starts to emerge in Chinese society at this time. These are basically academics and government officials. They will form the new upper class. And so now it's not just about what family you're born into, it's what civil position or academic position can you get in society. Finally, also, there is the growth of a urban middle class forming during the Song period as well. So many historians are arguing that the growth of this healthy middle class in urban centers allowed for China to become the most populous region in the world. In other words, if you can get a large number of okay people who are pretty well off, they're not suffering, they're not starving, they're not dying, you get them all together and be able to cluster them into urban centers, this allows your population to grow quite a bit more. You don't need as much land for all those people. Another really critical shift happens during the Song Dynasty here in China, and it's one that people are often anecdotally familiar with, but they don't really know where to place it in Chinese history. The status of women in China has traditionally always been lower than the status of men in China, and that's not specific to China. That's true of most of the world. When we look around and see, there are very few matriarchies and a whole lot of patriarchies. And it's during as their status falls even lower during the Tang period and the Song period, women become less important to Chinese society because this strong patriarchy starts forming during this time. And the end result of this, what we tend to see become very, very popular amongst the upper classes of Chinese society, is that girls will now be subject to a new custom known as foot binding. What this means is this involves binding the foot from externally, basically taking a wrap and pushing it around the foot. They do this from an extremely young age, so that to young Song girls, so that by the time they reach adulthood, their feet would be small and dainty, which are considered a desirable quality in Song China. This has a devastating impact on the structural integrity of the foot. And many upper-class Song women are going to suffer permanent disabilities due to this practice. I've put some rather gruesome photos, or at least I consider them to be gruesome, and it kind of shows you how this practice played out. And foot binding is going to remain a feature of Chinese society for a long time. But basically, you're not allowing the foot to grow from a young age, so the bones get all gnarled and pushed up together, and that's how the foot remains small. So in essence, yes, it's small, but it's deformed, and people can't walk on it anymore. And so you have incredible problems with this kind of practice here in China. And it's something that's really acute to upper-class women. They're the ones who are going to be engaging in this the most. So that sort of just closes off. That was a couple of fun little key facts about Song China, because we won't really be having a great opportunity to come back to China as a standalone subject again in our course. So I wanted to sort of wrap up and talk a little bit more about China in this lecture before we move on to mostly we'll be discussing Europe, the Islamic world, Sub-Saharan Africa, and the Americas moving forward. So that brings us to the last region of the world that is becoming very unified and also growing very, very prominent during this time period, and that is, of course, Europe. So after the fall of the Holy Roman Empire, Northern Europe collapsed from order into disorder. Areas like France, England, Spain, Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, they're all subjected to increased raiding and pillaging by Vikings from Scandinavia. So by 1100 Common Era, the Scandinavian homeland of the Vikings would become the target of Christian evangelists. And this is what will eventually bring the Nordic Europeans into this common European culture that's defined by inclusion of Christianity. So But for a number of years there, the Vikings are just going around wreaking havoc and destroying things. This is largely why Europe couldn't hold on to any of the Hellenistic information that was spread to them by way of Rome. Now, as Europe starts to rebound from these Viking raids, free laborers and warriors start to become less and less important. They start to get dispossessed of their right to carry weapons. And what that does is it turns them into mere agricultural laborers inside of basically a feudal system, something I'll talk about in a minute. But the system that starts to emerge there is that the laborers are no longer free people. They're actually going to become serfs. They have to live and work on lands controlled by lords. And they grow resources on these lands for the benefit of the lords of the manor, the person who is in charge of the land. So essentially, Europe's majority lived on somebody else's land and cultivated crops for that person, for their benefit. So this is a system that in European society we call manoralism. Manoralism and feudal serfdom, and I'll talk about feudalism in a moment. This is very, very striking, and it's important to understand this because you oftentimes, as a historian, it's difficult for me to have kind of people run around with this idea of the slave trade and European racism as it pertains to the slave trade. And I always tell people that you can't answer that question. You can't really look at it. It's a chicken and the egg thing unless you go back and look at the attitudes of Europeans before the Enlightenment and after the Enlightenment. Because when you look at Europe, when they do eventually spread out and start engaging with the Atlantic world and start forming the origins of the Atlantic slave trade, this is how most of Europe is living. So if you were to ask a European, is it wrong to take somebody and force them to work on your land for your benefit? They'd say, no, that's how we all live. It's not a unique system to them. It's not strange to them. And so I think you could easily make the argument that slavery, at its origins, the Atlantic slave trade wasn't really about racism. It was about labor acquisition. And it was about acquiring labor from other areas of the globe that would fit in the new economic schemes of the New World. I don't want to get too far off into, I'll talk about that when we get a little further into our lectures. Into the course, but that's the type of living arrangement that's happening in Europe. There's no more really free laborers. People are serfs. They don't have their own land. So for them to be able to work, they have to live on and work somebody else's land and crops for a pittance and the ability to live on that land. Now, manoralism as a concept would become the foundation of what a more pertinent concept known as feudalism. This is the process of you have a manor, and the lord is in control of the manor, and then you have all of your peasants living on the land and working the land around the land of the manor for the benefit of the lord. That's manoralism. Feudalism takes that a step further. It makes the people who are the lords of the manors born nobility, and it forces the people who are born into the laboring class that live on these manor lands permanent laborers. And so it entrenches, what it does is it takes these economic categories and it makes them fixed. That's what feudalism is. You can't be born a peasant and then become a land-owning noble. You can't be born a noble and then lose all your money and become a peasant. Even if you're poor and you're broke and you have nothing, you still have your land and you still basically own all the people who work on it. It's almost impossible to lose your status in feudal Europe. It is impossible to shake your status if you're of low status in feudal Europe. And so this is how Europe is going to be set up on the eve of expansion before they start going out into the world. And basically what we're seeing here in feudal Europe is three classes. You have the nobility on top. The clergy is sort of a separate class alone. They're very well off. They're very well connected. They're politically connected. They don't do any work for themselves. They rely on everybody else to produce for them. And then you have the commoners who are producing for everybody. And so that's the basic living arrangement that we're seeing in Europe during this time. Now, despite having these feudal arrangements and absolute monarchies over the nation states that we see in Europe, everything is tending to happen here over rather small geographic territories. So European empires and kingdoms and states are not that big because they're constantly growing, falling, fighting with one another. They don't get that huge. But Europe did come out of this age with a shared identity and culture. And this unity comes by way of Christianity. The uniform religious identity of Europe was held up against the growing Islamic world and the rapid population growth that we're seeing take place over in China. So, in the minds of Europeans, the single element that binds them together is that they are Christians. This is what it means to be European during this time. If you are European, you are a Christian. By way of being Christian, that's what makes you included in this larger category of European. Even though there are pockets of Europeans outside of Europe, they're not really considered as part of this framework. But Europe is really firmly going to fall into that sort of religious crux. That is what makes you a European. Your status as a Christian is what makes you European. And so they are basically looking at it in the minds of Europeans. It's this single element that binds them together. They're European because they're Christian, and the other spheres of the world are not. The Islamic world is obviously Muslim. The Chinese world's not Christian. The Indian world is not Christian. When they go to sub-Saharan Africa, when they go to the Americas, those worlds are not Christian. Therefore, they are seen as different, exotic, strange, otherly, and that's how Europeans are going to be treating those areas. Now, Christianity during this period spread from Western and Central Europe eastwards. Missionaries were bringing Christianity into Eastern Europe, and the religion is going to help expand the territory that we consider as part of Europe. It's making the whole of this region of Eastern Europe religiously uniform, and it's connecting them to far-flung places like Spain, France, and Portugal, and England. Now, all of a sudden, to be European means to be British, but also to be Polish. It means to be Spanish, but also Ukrainian. And so that's what we're seeing happening here. As Christendom spreads out, Europe gets to be a bigger place, and that identity gets bigger. This unity gets even more deeply entrenched with the beginnings of the Crusades, when warriors from all over Christian Europe would come together, regardless of their national origin, and they descend upon the Muslim-held city of Jerusalem in Palestine. This is what the European Christians are seeing as a holy land that needs to get reclaimed. I don't want to, steal my own thunder from that lecture later in the course. We will talk about the Crusades, but it suffices to say for now that Europeans' identities are being innately and firmly formed during this period because of that sort of religious identity, and then the fact that they are going to be pitted in warfare against a different religion. That entrenches that even further, so that by the time Europeans start going out widely around the whole world, that's what Europeanness is. European is Christianity, and Christianity is European. It's all the same identity. And that's why they're so innately concerned with spreading Christianity to other areas of the world when they spread out. So, the last thing we are going to be talking about in our lecture today is Genghis Khan and the spread of Mongolian authority and power across Eurasia. This is where we're going to see nomadic invaders changing the world. And this is a very, very different process from what we usually witness in this class. Usually, we're looking at big centralized empires, and we've seen this from the very beginning of the course, all the way back in the Neolithic and Mesopotamia. You find a central location, and from there you build out, but that's still always your capital, your center, your homeland. That's not the way the Mongols work. They're nomads. Because of that, their empire, as we call it, is going to look a lot different from the other empires that we've seen grow in other parts and times of world history. So generally speaking, the Mongols had very few technological breakthroughs. They don't do much for innovation in any way. They don't really spread any new religions. They don't write books. They don't write plays. They don't spread crops around. They don't change agricultural methods. They don't leave a whole lot of physical artifacts. They don't build a lot of things. They didn't hold on to any particular territory around the world for very long, maybe 100 years there, 100 years here. But this is what makes them different from all the other empires. These are the things that when we look at the growth of other empires, they get bigger, they get more complex and articulated, and they start popping out artwork. They start doing some really cool stuff and leaving giant buildings that we can dig out of the ground 1,000 years later. The Mongols don't do any of that. That's not really what their empire was all about. And because of that, the outside world sees them very differently. And we as historians, until very recently, have been very, very biased in our outlook against the Mongols and what they did or didn't do in this period of world history. But in their own time, the Mongols were viewed largely by everybody else in the world as being barbaric destroyers of culture. In other words, the Mongols were seen by the rest of the world as being uncivilized, savages. They don't even have a culture. When they come and conquer an area, it's simply to conquer it, kill the men, rape the women, put the children in slavery, steal every little bit of wealth we can, and then move on to the next place. It's not like they're stopping and building giant palaces. They're not putting temples together. They're not spreading a new religion. They're not doing any of these things. So when Christians, Buddhists, Confucians, and Muslims, when they all looked at the Mongols, they see them as savage warriors that fought for chaos rather than order. But that is not the fairest view of the Mongols. Historians have shared that view for a very long time. These guys are nothing but harbingers of chaos and disorder. But in reality, the Mongols will achieve quite an amazing feat when we look at what they do in world history. And we'll get to that by the end of this section of the lecture. So, to start with, we have to understand Mongol culture. And Mongol culture can be summed up pretty easily. These are nomadic steppe people who originate in the far east of Asia in the highlands above China. The Mongols essentially live their lives on horseback. They are fully comfortable living on horseback. They eat there. They sleep there. They could spend a week or more on the back of a horse without ever dismounting or getting off continuously. More importantly than any of those other things, they can fight from the back of a horse. And that's what's going to allow them to become so dominant and so successful during this time period. They are incredibly adept at fighting from horseback. Other armies that they came up against who tried to stop the spread of the Golden Horde and the Mongols, they were simply not prepared for this. No other military in the world could do what the Mongols could do. They were rapid. They were highly mobile. That type of warfare leaves everybody else in the dust. And so one by one, the world's armies just start falling before Genghis Khan and his Mongol invaders as he starts branching out and spreading into the known world. In other words, nobody really can move as fast and as well as a Mongolian warrior, even though they're lightly armored, even though their horses are actually a bit smaller and slower than horses on within opposing armies and opposing cavalries. The Mongols are so good with the horses that they do have. They're so adept at firing a bow and arrow from the back of a horse, from lancing somebody from the back of a horse, from hacking at somebody with a sword or a battle axe from the back of a horse. It doesn't matter that their horses are inferior because they are superior in terms of their skills at manipulating and using these horses in warfare. So, essentially, it's this element of being equestrian that gives the Mongols their ferocity and their ability to conquer. The Mongols were oriented around extreme mobility. They basically could carry their houses with them on their back. When they were running low on supplies, food, and water, they knew how to drain their horse's blood and stay alive while also keeping the horse alive. And they could travel up to 62 miles per day. This is phenomenal for this time period. You don't have any other army capable of doing this. They also did some things that, again, when historians and then the cultures that were contemporaries of the Mongols look at them and they say, a bunch of mindless, barbaric savages. That's not really true. They are really, really well-articulated societies. They put together elaborate priority mail systems that allow them to be able to send orders rapidly. Remember, we're talking about an empire that at one point is going to stretch from China all the way to Mongolia. No, that's not that far. I screwed that up. China all the way to Poland. That's how big this empire is. They actually built out a mail system so that their commanders can send orders across this vast distance very rapidly. And that comes along with having a guy who can carry that message really, really fast on a horse, and he never stops riding. So the real key of the Mongol military is their archers. They're incredibly deadly. They're super accurate. They fight from horseback, so it's hard to hit them and take them out. And their arrows can kill their enemies at up a distance of up to 350 yards. The curved shape of their bows, and I put a picture of that up there on the PowerPoints for you, it allows a rather small guy who doesn't have great leverage or balance of gravity. You know, if I were standing and shooting, I'm not going to do it because you'll just be seeing my pants and it won't really help. But if I were standing, you need kind of anybody who's familiar with archery, you need a strong, wide base in your legs. Your legs being well set is very important to shooting accurately and shooting with power. But the Mongols don't set their feet. They're doing this from the back of a horse. Their bows are meant to give you that same stability and power when you pull back on it. The tensile strength of that curved shape is quite a bit greater. And so it makes them extremely deadly and very, very accurate from long distances. By the time that Genghis Khan is done with his crusade, or crusade is kind of the wrong word, with his sort of campaign of conquest, the Mongolian Empire spreads. It's taken over pretty much most of China, going down into today what we would call South Asia, down into areas like Indonesia, Vietnam, those areas. But they've taken over China. They've gone up to Tibet, all the way to the borders of India. They've taken over all of Persia and most of the Islamic world to the east of the Arabian Peninsula. They've spread into the Caspian area, to the Black Sea. They've spread all the way up into Kiev and Moscow. They've gone right across Russia. They've crossed the Volga. In fact, it's actually some new literature out there, and I'm not sure whether your textbook has integrated this or not. I don't think they talk too much about this. But it's actually more and more common to believe that it was heavy, heavy rains in this time period in the area of Central Asia, Central Europe, the sort of border between Central and Eastern Europe. They think that Genghis Khan decides to turn back simply because it gets real muddy and real swampy, and his horses can't navigate the battlefields as well anymore. So in a lot of ways, they think it's rain that actually stopped the Mongolian spread. He makes it further than the spread of his empire. He goes as far east as Central Europe and starts threatening some areas of Central Europe as well. But Genghis Khan is going to be an incredibly important figure in world history and in the history of Eurasia. Because under Genghis Khan, the Mongols would build the largest empire in history, stretching from Poland all the way back to China. It stretched over a territory of 13.8 million square miles, and nearly 100 million people lived under Mongolian rule. So this is a pretty big and important empire. Genghis Khan himself is really going to be an important figure right around from between 1206 Common Era to 1227 Common Era. That's the time period for his spread, his war, his campaign of conquest. So it's under the leadership of Genghis Khan that the combination of Mongol discipline, their military technology and strategies of fighting from horseback, and there is this element of the overall ruthlessness or perceived ruthlessness of the Mongols that helps them take control of all of Central Asia and northern China. By the time of Genghis Khan's death in 1220s, again 1227 is when he dies, the Mongol armies had moved westward into the Islamic lands and were threatening Central Europe. Genghis is exceptionally ruthless, and he's also very, very shrewd. Again, for most of history, he's been shown as a stark, raving, mad, drooling psychopath content on burning everything to the ground, raping all the women, and killing everything he sees. He is not that, believe me. This is a shrewd and calculating military commander. First off, if you were just some stark, raving, mad lunatic, you probably wouldn't be all that adept at exploiting new military technologies and tactics in warfare. He's very, very strategic in the way that he engages with other armies. This is an important feature of his success in his campaign of conquest. In addition to that, this guy keeps a spy network everywhere across his empire. If somebody says one thing bad about Genghis Khan, Genghis Khan is going to hear about it. And believe me, you don't want to get on this guy's bad side. So the other thing that Genghis Khan is very good at is he is exceptionally adept at playing rivals against each other. So basically, he'll come marching with his army up into a territory, and he'll reach out to two different states, and he'll say, "Well, I'm here. You've seen what I've done with the rest of the world. I take what I want. That's how it's going. Do you want to help me conquer these guys, or do you want them to help me conquer you? Take your pick." And so, obviously, he's basically saying, "I'm going to crush you both. Do you want to be on my side, or do you want to be on the other, or do you want to be against me? And the other guy will be on my side." And so he plays traditional enemies and rivals against one another very, very well. Again, this isn't a campaign of blood and mayhem. This is calculated. This is a guy marching and building an empire in a very organized and set way and method. So I've kind of given you a timeline of the Mongol Empire. Between 1206 and 1227, that's when Genghis Khan is in, and they are just rolling across the known world, conquering everything in their path. In there, I've broken down some of the key dates. In his lifetime, they conquered northern China between 1211 and 1234. That's actually one of their most drawn out and difficult campaigns. They are going to carry out the conquest of Persia between 1219 and 1221 over the course of 2 years. So the entire Iranian plateau is under their control after that time. They dominate Russia between 1237 and 1241, taking control of that area. They march into the heartland of Mesopotamia, and they take the major capital of Baghdad there in 1258. And then they go on and conquer the rest of southern China that had been formed out of the Song dynasty between 1264 and 1279. So they are going through these campaigns of conquest and just absolutely rolling over everything they see. Now, Genghis dies in 1227, and by that time, the empire is already pretty much built. And what is going to happen is when he dies, his entire territory gets broken down and given to various khans. And so they're broken down and they form what they call khanates or minor kingdoms. They were all established amongst his children. And so you had four major khanates will rise up after the death of Genghis Khan. So all of these areas would work to add territory and tributary states to the empire, which would continue to take shape under later Mongol leaders. But to give you an idea of what's happening here, Mongol control eventually would spread over to Western Europe, the Middle East, North Africa, and all of China. But the ruling class of these Mongol khanates often continued to control aspects of the territory under their supervision of Mongol rulers. And so what you're seeing here is, I kind of said that in the back. Let me say it far more clearly. The Mongols don't necessarily replace the existing leadership. They use them. They say, you were a king before, now you're a Mongol tax collector. Go and get the money from the people, give part of it back to me, but otherwise you can sit here and call yourself king whatever you want and stay in control of your territory. So that's another way the Mongols broke things down politically. But to give you an idea of how this all worked is Genghis was incredible. Between 1206 and 1227, he shoots up and conquers all this land. Once it's given to his kid and it breaks down into all these khanates, they start losing territory really rapidly. Which is why I said basically these things are only, the Mongols are there for a very short period of time. They kind of rise up, take over everything, and then completely collapse back down again into obscurity. But for about 100 years, there is something known as the Pax Mongolia, or the Mongolian Peace. This is a period of relative peace and stability in many areas of Eurasia, and it led to intense economic and social development that would have been impossible without the order brought into these territories by the Mongolian Empire. In other words, you have areas like the Iranian Plateau. It was in a state of warfare when the Mongols showed up. By the time the Mongols leave, trade is safe. You don't have bandits on the road. You don't have trade being threatened by war. Things are going well between neighbors on the Persian Plateau. This is what they call the Pax Mongolia. Yes, they came in and they killed a lot of people. Yes, they came in and they conquered a lot of territory. But they brought order to otherwise disordered places at that point in the world. And so you're seeing that the Pax Mongolia is spreading for 100 years. This is something that this authoritarian sort of rule and regime helps bring order to an otherwise chaotic world as it's taking shape. So, the last thing I want to say about the Mongol Empire is just some sort of stuff that will give us a little bit different look at how they actually operated. Again, history is lost. When I went to school, basically the Mongols were just savages. They were horseback warriors that were better at killing everybody else, but they had no culture of their own, no value to their culture. And obviously, that's a very, very flawed view of any particular nation state or empire. The Mongols actually accomplished quite a bit during their time period. The Mongol rulers ordered the construction of roads, bridges. They extend the Grand Canal in China, and they set up post offices and trading posts all over Eurasia. So with their spread, with the spread of Pax Mongolia, with this Mongolian peace that comes across Eurasia, you're seeing better infrastructure, meaning people and products and ideas and things can move more quickly around this area. Better communication along this infrastructure. They're allowing for major large scale sort of construction projects in terms of aqueducts, dams, things like that, bridges, canals. These are all major building points. Now, under Genghis, you don't see a lot of this happening, but under the Khanate and the Khans that rule after Genghis, this is something that starts to take shape within the Mongolian Empire. The Mongols protected merchants and gave them higher status in Eurasian society than they previously had. They allow these areas to set up merchants' associations that facilitate trade. And so, under the Mongolian Empire, you have an unprecedented spread of goods and products. So, the Mongolian rulers are offering tax benefits to any religious leaders, just like the federal government in the US does today. And so they're actually encouraging the worship of any different type of religion. They're not carrying out any sort of religious oppression. They're not trying to squash the light that is Christianity in Europe. They're not trying to destroy the message of Islam in the Arabian Peninsula. They're not trying to quash out Buddhism in China. They're allowing for all these things. And in fact, they employ people of different religious ethnicity, race, religion doesn't mean much to the Mongolians. They don't really care what you are. They care if you can help them build their empire out and facilitate the day-to-day operations of it. And so you tend to see Muslims being brought into China to help with the administration of China there. Christians and Jewish people would be working in the other posts of the Mongolian government. This is something Marco Polo travels up and sees Europeans working for Kublai Khan when he travels there. This is all something that you tend not to see in other parts of the world. When we saw the consolidation of Song dynasty, you had to be ethnic Han to be any part of Chinese society. For the Mongolians, they don't care. You a white European guy who practices Catholicism? You're cool. You can work for the Mongolians. Are you a Jewish guy living in North Africa? Yeah, you can set up a trade association and facilitate trade in the Mediterranean. Are you of Arabic descent, practicing Islam, and you're doing business in the South Indian Sea? Well, you're good too. Everybody is fine to live the way they were living under the Mongolian Empire. And this has definitely changed historians' views of them. They're clearly not these horrific overlords that force everybody into some savage or barbaric way of living. They actually did have some understanding of how to facilitate and run a society. However, the reason they're kind of doomed to collapse is because of constant infighting between the four khanates. All of Eurasia is falling under these khanates, and they start going to war with one another. When that happens, that's what causes the rapid decline of the Mongolian Empire. Not so much the actions of some other empire coming into conflict with it. It's all about internal fighting amongst the people to whom power was left by Genghis Khan. So you can say that Genghis Khan, while brilliant, while definitely an effective conqueror, he didn't have the best plan for secession. He didn't really know how to pass his empire off and keep it sustainable. So it broke down into these various khanates who all went to war with each other, and eventually the Mongols would be displaced and sort of supplanted by local grown rulers once again when we come out of this period. So That wraps up my lecture for this week. I know it was a long one, but if you have any questions, comments, concerns, demagoguery, or diatribe, you know where to find me. Feel free to reach out. Take care.